Hello, everyone. So we're finally getting some traction, some responses from the Russian side. And basically, if you strip away all the fluff, it's talking about nothing. If I have any fans of Asimov's Foundation series out there, do you remember that bit? I think it's in the first book, where a trade and security deal was negotiated by a delegation and a government of this planet. And they brought with them a device that recorded everything that was said and then analyzed it and stripped everything that was basically just fluff. And when they went back to listen to the recording, there was nothing left. Basically, nothing was said, nothing was promised, nothing was agreed on, at which point one of the main characters pointed out this trip was a waste of time. This is exactly what is happening right now with this whole ceasefire deal. Ukraine was very specific. They said, this is what we'll do, this is what we'll agree to. This is what we would like to see long term. Russia says we have questions. Why do you have questions? You started this war. This is not complicated. Basically, it's asking you to stop murdering people. How's that? Is that simple enough for you? Now, there is one question that is a good question and one that is suggestive. So let's walk through this. What would happen in the Russian region of Kursk? I think that's a TBD, to be determined. Depending on Russian reply. Ukraine would use the 30-day ceasefire to mobilize, rearm, and train people. That's projecting. The fact that he is thinking about this for Ukraine, he's thinking about it for himself. Because, remember, we talked about this. Ukraine held 200 ceasefire talks with Russia between 2014, annexation of Crimea, and 2022, a full-scale invasion. As the result, 25 times a ceasefire was agreed upon. And each and every time the ceasefire was violated by Russia, and that's exactly what happened. They just used that time to rearm, mobilize, train people. And then there is who would police any ceasefire deal. And I'm sure Ukrainians want to know that too. Because otherwise, how is that different from just holding the line, which is what they have already been doing? Now, this is very interesting. This last paragraph is very interesting. There's a difference in what the two sides are suggesting. Russia wants to decide everything in one fell swoop. That is only possible if Russia immediately withdraws all troops out of everywhere. Ukraine wants to go in two stages. First stage, the 30-day ceasefire, and then to see how that goes and move on to anything bigger, which I think is a good approach. Because, again, given its experience with Russian ceasefires, they're just watching for Russia to violate the ceasefire and be able to see, okay, see, we've done this. It happened again. Now what? As far as the Kursk region is concerned, Russians have retaken most of the territory that Ukrainians were occupying since August. But again, considering that a fairly small group of Ukrainian troops have been lodged there since August, and they still haven't gotten rid of them all, is rather telling. And this is after throwing both Russian troops at them and North Korean troops at them. Ukrainians are not sitting on it. Basically, what they're doing is evacuating that area on the Ukrainian side, which is a good idea, because we already know, we've seen this all over the place, all along the border. Russia uses border regions as a jumping off point to stage attacks into Ukraine, be it launching missiles a little bit closer, creating airfields there to launch their airplanes, to have a staging area for troops and supplies. So, Ukraine is saying, okay, this is going to become a military object in like the next 15 minutes. Let's get people out, let's evacuate the civilians, and then we can start pummeling these assholes, if necessary. The French and the British and the Canadians are all basically calling it like it is, and they are frankly appalled that the US government refuses to call it what it is, an aggression, an invasion, a war started by Russia. Canada and the UK continue being very vocal in their support of Ukraine and are actively working on rearming Europe. And basically, this is all the result of realization that US is a shitty ally at this point. Now, this is important. So these two pieces here are very, very important. One is we might get some more of the long-range bombs. That's important for obvious reasons. This is for the ATACMS. And ATACMS have been used very, very well by Ukrainians. And then there's the second point. Nobody ever talks about this. Does anybody remember the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in 2023? You know, we've seen the images of flooding, people on the roofs, people rescuing each other, people rescuing their animals, and so on and so forth. What they're leaving out is the problem with the environmental issues now in that area, because the lake bed sediment contains heavy metals, including lead, cadmium, and nickel. And all of that has been exposed now that the Kakhovka reservoir has been basically drained. Again, and this is just one example of what Russians did in Ukraine, environmentally. It's going to take decades to fix this. That's if the war ends anytime soon. And then there is that question, and let's go back to Putin's questions as to who's going to enforce it. That's been a question across the board, because forget an armed truce. We can't even freaking enforce the sanctions properly. This is not the first such investigation conducted by Kyiv Independent, where they pretended to be a Russian company and tried to buy countries that technically are supposed to be under the sanctions, so they're not supposed to be buying anything from Russia, particularly military and electronic components. And yet, the investigation continued. Basically, everybody was asking the question, how is it that Russia is still able to produce all these missiles, drones, glide bombs, and so on and so forth? They don't have their own microchip industry to the level required to have such a mass of weapons. Well, here's your answer. They're buying them from countries that are not supposed to be selling them to Russia. And this is not even anything complicated. This is not like some fanciful piece of espionage. Basically, all the investigative journalists did was they went through the old emails, old evidence, suggesting that countries were still trading with Russia and selling electronic components to Russia. And then they just basically asked, pretending to be a Russian company. That is like the most basic kind of espionage you can do. And they got the information they wanted. They basically said, come on over, we'll sell it to you. So, if we're unable to even enforce the sanctions we ourselves have introduced, how the heck are we gonna enforce a ceasefire?